The university library hummed with the quiet intensity of midterm season when 12 Navy SEALs in full dress uniform entered through the main doors. Students looked up from their laptops, confused by the sight of combat-hardened warriors moving with tactical precision through the rows of study tables. The men weren't there for books. They were there for the woman sitting alone in the corner, reading a worn paperback of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's Wind, Sand, and Stars. She didn't look up when they approached. Her weathered hands, steady as granite, turned another page. The afternoon light caught the faded scar running from her left temple to her jaw, a mark she'd carried for 15 years. The SEALs formed a perfect semicircle around her table. The lead operator, Commander Jake "Hammer" Harrison, cleared his throat. Still, she didn't acknowledge them. Not until Harrison spoke the words that would echo through that library forever. "Lieutenant Colonel Vera Phoenix Kowalski, we've come to pay a debt." The students watched, phones forgotten, as one of America's most decorated female combat pilots finally raised her eyes. Those eyes, gray as storm clouds over Kandahar, had seen things most people couldn't imagine. The SEALs, warriors who'd faced death countless times, stood at attention and rendered a crisp salute. The library fell into absolute silence. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to stop their buzzing. Vera Kowalski closed her book slowly, marking her page with a receipt from the campus coffee shop. She stood, all 5 feet 4 inches of her, and returned their salute with the precision of someone who'd spent 3 decades perfecting the gesture. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd commanded squadrons in 3 different wars, "you're making a scene." Harrison smiled, a rare expression for a man who'd led over 200 combat operations. "Ma'am, some scenes need to be made." What happened next would become legend at the university, a story passed down through generations of students. But to understand why 12 of America's elite warriors had traveled 3,000 miles to salute a retired Air Force pilot in a college library, you need to know about a night 15 years earlier, when the mountains of eastern Afghanistan erupted in fire, and a lone A-10 Thunderbolt II, call sign Phoenix 1, changed the definition of what it meant to leave no one behind. The story begins not with Vera Kowalski, but with her father, Stanislaw Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who'd fled Soviet oppression in 1981 with nothing but the clothes on his back and a dream of freedom. He'd found work in a Detroit auto plant, married a schoolteacher named Margaret, and raised 3 daughters. Vera was the middle child, the quiet one, the one who spent hours watching planes take off from Detroit Metropolitan Airport. The recruitment office was skeptical when 18-year-old Vera walked in on a humid July morning in 1991. 5 feet 4, 110 pounds, with thick glasses and a slight stutter when nervous. The recruiter, Staff Sergeant Mills, had seen plenty of kids with pilot dreams, most washed out in basic training. But there was something in Vera's eyes when she spoke about flying, not the romantic notion of it, but the mathematics, the physics, the beautiful violence of controlling 30 tons of metal and munitions at 400 miles per hour. Mills had been in the Air Force long enough to recognize the rare combination of intelligence and hunger that produced exceptional pilots. He pushed the paperwork across the desk. "Sign here, kid. Let's see if you've got what it takes." Basic training at Lackland Air Force Base nearly broke her. Not physically. Vera had spent her teenage years running 5 miles every morning preparing for this moment. It was the social dynamics that challenged her. The other recruits, mostly male, mostly larger, saw her as a mascot at best, a liability at worst. During combat training exercises, she was consistently chosen last for teams. During classroom instruction on aircraft systems, her raised hand was often ignored. But Vera had learned patience from her father, who'd waited 6 years for his citizenship papers. She kept her head down, scored perfect marks on every written exam, and qualified expert on every weapon system. The instructors noticed. More importantly, so did Colonel Patricia Anderson, one of the few female instructor pilots at the base. Anderson pulled Vera aside after a particularly brutal day of survival training. Kowalski, do you know what they call female pilots in combat zones? Vera shook her head. Nothing. Because when you're good enough, when you're the one they call when everything goes to hell, gender becomes irrelevant. But you have to be twice as good to get half the respect. Can you handle that? Vera's response was immediate. Colonel, my father escaped communist Poland hidden in a cargo container for 3 days without food or water. I can handle anything. Flight training at Columbus Air Force Base separated the dreamers from the pilots. The T-37 Tweet, the Air Force's primary trainer, was unforgiving. It didn't care about your gender, your background, or your excuses. You either mastered it or you washed out. Vera's small stature, initially seen as a disadvantage, proved to be an asset. She could withstand higher G-forces than most of her classmates, her lower body mass allowing blood to reach her brain more easily during extreme maneuvers. While others fought tunnel vision and grayout, Vera remained conscious and in control. Her instructor, Major Thomas "Hawk" Hawkins, a Vietnam veteran with 3 distinguished flying crosses, noticed her natural ability to maintain spatial orientation during complex aerobatic maneuvers. Kowalski, he said after she'd executed a perfect Immelman turn, where'd you learn to feel the aircraft like that? She thought about the question. Sir, I spent summers working in my uncle's machine shop. Every tool has its own vibration, its own rhythm. The Tweet's just another tool, just bigger. Hawkins laughed, a rare sound from the typically stoic instructor. Most pilots think of the aircraft as an extension of themselves. You think of yourself as an extension of the aircraft. That's the difference between good pilots and great ones. The transition to combat aircraft came next. While her classmates competed for spots flying F-16 Vipers and F-15 Eagles, Vera requested assignment to the A-10 Thunderbolt II program. The Warthog, as it was affectionately known, wasn't sexy. It was slow, ugly, and designed around a massive 30mm GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon. It was a flying tank, built to take enormous punishment while providing close air support to ground troops. Her flight commander was bewildered. Kowalski, you're third in your class, you could fly anything. Why the hog? Vera's answer revealed the philosophy that would define her entire career. Sir, fighter pilots fly above the war. A-10 pilots fly in it. When soldiers are pinned down, when they're out of options, they don't call for an F-16. They call for a hog driver. I want to be the one who answers that call. The commander signed her transfer request without another word. He'd been a hog driver himself in Desert Storm. He knew exactly what she meant. Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona became her new home. The A-10 community was different from the fighter jock culture she'd experienced in training. These were pilots who measured success not in air-to-air kills but in lives saved, in soldiers who made it home because a warthog had cleared their path. The aircraft itself was a marvel of purposeful engineering. Titanium armor protected the cockpit. The engines were mounted high to avoid debris. The control systems had multiple redundancies. It could fly with half a wing missing, one engine dead, and hydraulics shot to pieces. It was, in every sense, a survivor's aircraft. Her first instructor in the A-10, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Bones Williams, was a Gulf War veteran who'd had his aircraft shot up so badly that crew chiefs had stopped counting the holes at 300. He taught Vera the unwritten rules of close air support. The guys on the ground don't care about your perfect bombing scores or your by-the-book procedures. They care about one thing: will you be there when they need you? Will you fly into hell itself to protect them? Because that's the job. Everything else is secondary. Vera's first combat deployment came in 2003, just as the Iraq War was shifting from invasion to occupation. Baghdad International Airport was a maze of temporary structures, concrete barriers, and constant activity. The temperature hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit on the tarmac. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of burning oil from fires that had been burning since the invasion. She was assigned to the 75th Fighter Squadron, call sign Tiger. As the only female pilot in the squadron, she expected resistance. What she found was professional indifference. Nobody cared who you were as long as you could do the job. Her first combat mission came 3 days after arrival. A Marine convoy had been ambushed near Fallujah. The forward air controller's voice crackled through her headset, tight with barely controlled panic. "Tiger flight, troops in contact. We have casualties. Need immediate close air support." Vera rolled in, the Warthog's cannon spitting depleted uranium rounds at 3,900 rounds per minute. The distinctive BRRRRT of the GAU-8 echoed across the desert. The insurgent positions evaporated under her fire. The Marines made it out, all of them. That night she couldn't sleep, not from fear or regret, but from the adrenaline of knowing she'd made a difference. Her wingman, Captain Derek Buzz Rodriguez, found her on the flight line at 300, doing her own pre-flight inspection for the next day's mission. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. She ran her hand along the Warthog's scarred fuselage. "Buzz, today I understood why this aircraft exists. It's not about the technology or the tactics. It's about being the guardian angel for kids who are thousands of miles from home." Rodriguez nodded. He'd had the same revelation on his first combat mission 2 years earlier. The deployment stretched from 3 months to 6, then 9. The insurgency was evolving, becoming more sophisticated. Surface-to-air missiles, particularly the SA-7 and SA-14 MANPADS, began appearing in enemy hands. Vera's aircraft was hit twice, once by small arms fire that peppered her right wing, and once by an RPG that exploded close enough to rattle her teeth. Both times, the Warthog shrugged off the damage and kept flying. She developed a reputation among ground forces. When troops heard Phoenix 1 check in on the radio, they knew they had a pilot who would stay on station until the job was done. The incident that would define the first phase of her career happened in November 2003. A Special Forces A-team was pinned down in a compound north of Tikrit. They'd been conducting a raid on a high-value target when everything went wrong. The intelligence was faulty. Instead of a dozen insurgents, they faced over 100. The 12-man team was surrounded, running low on ammunition, with 2 seriously wounded. The weather was deteriorating. A massive sandstorm was rolling in from the west. Most pilots would have called it unflyable. Vera listened to the tactical frequency as the team leader, a young captain named Mike Thompson, tried to maintain calm while calling for extraction. The helicopters couldn't fly in the sandstorm. Artillery was out of range. Fast movers couldn't see the target through the dust. Phoenix 1 was their only option. Vera checked her fuel, enough for maybe 2 passes before she'd have to return to base. The visibility was dropping by the second. She could barely see her own wings. "Phoenix 1 is inbound," she announced. "Talk me in." What followed was 15 minutes of flying that defied every safety regulation in the book. Using only the voice of the forward air controller and her instruments, Vera made 6-gun runs through the sandstorm. She couldn't see the ground until she was less than 500 feet above it. Each pass required threading between buildings, power lines, and the swirling wall of sand. On her 4th pass, warning lights erupted across her cockpit. She was flying on one engine, the other had ingested too much sand. She should have returned to base. Instead, she made 2 more runs. The Special Forces team made it out. All 12 of them, including the wounded. Captain Thompson would later say in his after-action report, "Phoenix 1 exhibited a level of tactical flying and personal courage that exceeded anything I've witnessed in 15 years of special operations. She didn't just save our lives, she redefined what close air support means." The report was classified, as most special operations after-action reports were. But within the special operations community, the story spread. Phoenix 1 became a legend. Vera rotated home in 2004, but the war followed her. She volunteered for every deployment, eventually accumulating more combat hours in the A-10 than any other female pilot in Air Force history. Afghanistan became her second home. The mountains of the Hindu Kush, the valleys of Helmand Province, the endless expanse of the Registan Desert, she knew them all. She could navigate by terrain features alone, recognizing individual ridgelines and villages from thousands of feet above. By 2010, she'd been promoted to major and was leading her own flight of 4 warthogs. The younger pilots called her Professor for her habit of turning every mission into a teaching opportunity. She developed her own tactics for operating in the challenging Afghan terrain, techniques that would later be incorporated into official Air Force doctrine. But it was her philosophy of close air support that truly set her apart. While other pilots saw themselves as separate from the ground war, Vieira understood that every soldier on the ground was someone's child, someone's parent, someone's loved one. That personal connection drove her to take risks others wouldn't. The Taliban learned to fear the sound of her aircraft. They had spotters who could identify individual pilots by their attack patterns. When Phoenix 1 appeared overhead, insurgent attacks often stopped immediately. They knew she would hunt them relentlessly, following them into valleys where other pilots wouldn't venture, staying on station long past when others would have returned to base. She became, in essence, a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Her crew chief, Technical Sergeant Angela Martinez, had been maintaining Vieira's aircraft for 3 years. She'd seen it return with so much battle damage that by all rights it shouldn't have been flying. "Major," she said one evening as they inspected a particularly nasty cluster of bullet holes, "do you have a death wish, or are you just that good?" Vieira smiled, running her hand over the patched aluminum. "Martinez, death is just another tactical problem. As long as I solve it correctly, we both keep our jobs." But the war was taking its toll. Not physically. Vieira maintained the same rigid fitness routine she'd started as a teenager. It was the mental weight of constant combat, of making life-and-death decisions every day, of writing letters to the families of soldiers she couldn't save. She stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. Food became purely functional fuel. Relationships were impossible to maintain. The only constant in her life was the warthog and the mission. Lieutenant Colonel David Preacher Williams, her squadron commander, pulled her aside after she'd volunteered for her 7th deployment. "Vieira, you've done enough, more than enough. No one would think less of you for taking a staff position." She looked at him with those gray eyes that had seen too much. "Sir, with respect, there are kids out there who need air cover. As long as I can fly, I'll fly." Williams knew better than to argue. He'd seen that look before. In Vietnam veterans who couldn't leave the war behind because they knew their absence might cost lives. The mission that would change everything came on a moonless night in September 2010. The mountains of eastern Afghanistan were darker than seemed possible, as if the earth itself had swallowed all light. Operation Dragon's Breath was a classified mission involving multiple special operations teams, including a SEAL platoon led by a young lieutenant commander named Jake Harrison. The operation had been planned for months, a simultaneous strike on 6 Taliban command posts scattered across the Shulaykat Valley. It was ambitious, complex, and dependent on precise timing. Vieira was leading a flight of 4 A-10s in support of the operation. They'd been briefed that enemy anti-aircraft capabilities were minimal. The intelligence was wrong. The Taliban had been preparing for months, moving in heavy weapons under cover of darkness, including ZSU-23 4 anti-aircraft guns and modern Chinese-made MA and PADS. They'd turned the valley into a trap, and the American forces had flown right into it. The first indication of trouble came when Phoenix 3 reported taking fire. Then Phoenix 4's engine exploded, forcing the pilot to eject over hostile territory. The radio erupted with urgent calls. Every team on the ground was in contact, taking heavy fire. The Taliban had waited until all elements were committed before springing their ambush. It was a massacre in the making. Harrison's SEAL platoon was particularly exposed, pinned down on a ridgeline with nowhere to go. They'd lost their air controller in the first minutes of the fight. Harrison himself was calling in strikes, his voice strained but controlled. "Phoenix 1, Trident 6. We have multiple casualties. Enemy has us fixed from 3 sides. Danger close fire mission." Vieira could hear automatic weapons fire in the background of his transmission. She rolled in, knowing that the anti-aircraft fire would be concentrated on her approach. The night sky erupted with tracers, green and orange streams of death reaching up toward her aircraft. The Warthog shuddered as rounds impacted the fuselage. Warning lights painted her cockpit red. She pickled her ordnance and pulled off, the explosion below illuminating the mountainside. "Good hits, Phoenix 1, Harrison called. "But we're still taking fire from the east. Can you make another run?" Vera checked her damage, hydraulic pressure dropping, left aileron barely responding, fuel leaking from at least 2 punctures. Any reasonable pilot would have returned to base, but she could still hear the gunfire over the radio, could hear the pain in Harrison's voice as he called for a medic. "Phoenix 1 is inbound," she replied. The second run was worse. The Taliban had her approach pattern figured out. The anti-aircraft fire was a solid wall of metal. The Warthog bucked and groaned, pieces of the wing departing into the night. She fired everything she had left, the last of her rockets, her remaining bombs, and nearly 3,000 rounds from the cannon. The eastern ridgeline erupted in secondary explosions. The Taliban position was eliminated, but Vera's aircraft was dying. "Phoenix 2, Phoenix 1. I'm hit bad, lost engine 2. Engine 1 failing. Hydraulics gone, I'm not making it back to base." Her wingman, Captain Rodriguez, immediately responded, "Phoenix 1, Kandahar is 40 miles, you can make it." Vera looked at her instruments, altitude dropping. No way to maintain controlled flight much longer. Below her, Harrison's platoon was still pinned down, still taking sporadic fire. The extraction helicopters were still 20 minutes out. She made a decision that would be studied in military academies for decades to come. "Negative, Phoenix 2. I'm staying on station. Trident 6, Phoenix 1. I have about 5 minutes of flight time and 1,200 rounds of 30 Mike. Where do you need it?" Harrison couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Phoenix 1, you need to get out of here." Vera's response was calm, professional. "Negative, Trident. You have wounded that need those extraction birds. I'm your cover until they arrive. Now give me a target." For the next 5 minutes, Vera Kowalski flew a dying aircraft through the mountains of Afghanistan, making gun runs at impossible angles, using her crippled Warthog as both weapon and shield. She flew so low that Harrison could see her face illuminated by the cockpit lights. On her last pass, with the engine seized and flying on momentum alone, she salvoed her last 400 rounds into a Taliban mortar position that had been bracketing the landing zone. The extraction helicopters arrived just as Phoenix 1 disappeared over a ridgeline. Harrison's platoon was evacuated successfully, 18 SEALs, all wounded to varying degrees, but all alive. The official report listed Vera as missing in action after her aircraft crashed in enemy territory. The crash site was deemed too dangerous for immediate recovery operations. For 72 hours, her fate was unknown. Search and rescue operations were launched and recalled due to weather and enemy activity. The Special Operations community held its breath. What they didn't know was that Vera had survived the crash. The Warthog had lived up to its reputation one last time, the titanium bathtub protecting her through an impact that should have been fatal. She'd landed hard in a ravine, the aircraft cartwheeling before coming to rest inverted. Her left arm was broken in 3 places. Her ribs were cracked. Blood from a head wound clouded her vision, but she was alive. Training kicked in. She activated her personal locator beacon, knowing it would bring both rescue forces and the enemy. She salvaged what she could from the wreckage, her sidearm, survival kit, and the emergency radio. Then she moved, crawling through the darkness away from the crash site. She could hear voices in the distance, Pashto and Arabic. The Taliban were hunting her. For 3 days she evaded capture, moving only at night, hiding in caves and crevices during daylight. Her water ran out on day 2. The pain from her injuries was constant, overwhelming. On the morning of the 4th day, delirious from dehydration and infection, she was spotted by a Taliban patrol. She'd made it nearly 15 miles from the crash site, an astounding distance given her injuries. The engagement was brief. Vera, with one good arm, managed to eliminate 2 fighters before her ammunition ran out. She was preparing to use her last grenade, on herself rather than be captured, when the distinctive sound of rotor blades filled the valley. The rescue operation was led by the same SEAL platoon she'd saved 4 days earlier. Jake Harrison, against medical advice and with his own wounds barely closed, had insisted on leading the mission. They fast-roped directly onto her position, Harrison himself carrying her to the extraction helicopter. The last thing she remembered before losing consciousness was Harrison's voice. "We've got you, Phoenix. We don't leave anyone behind, especially not the angel who refused to leave us." Vera spent 3 months at Walter Reed recovering from her injuries. The head wound had caused significant scarring. Her left arm required multiple surgeries to repair, but worse than the physical injuries was the psychological impact. For the first time in her career, she couldn't fly. The doctors were optimistic about eventual recovery, but the Air Force Medical Board was less certain. There were discussions of medical retirement, of a training position, of anything except returning to combat flying. During her recovery, she received visitors, lots of them, soldiers and Marines she'd supported over the years, most of whom she'd never met. They came to say thank you, to tell her what her actions had meant. A young corporal from Iowa brought his newborn daughter, named Vera, in her honor. A Special Forces sergeant, his leg amputated below the knee, told her about the day her gun runs had saved his entire team. The stories accumulated, each one a reminder of why she'd taken the risks she had. Jake Harrison visited every week when he was stateside. He'd bring coffee from a shop near the hospital, and they'd sit in silence, two warriors who understood that some experiences couldn't be reduced to words. It was Harrison who told her about the investigation into her shoot-down. The Taliban commander who'd orchestrated the ambush had been specifically targeting her. They'd studied her tactics, her patterns. They knew that Phoenix One would never abandon troops in contact, and they'd used that knowledge against her. In a perverse way, it was the ultimate compliment. The medical board's decision came down in January 2011. Vera was cleared for limited duty but prohibited from combat operations. Her flying days, at least in the A-10, were over. She was assigned to the Air Force Weapons School as an instructor, teaching the next generation of attack pilots. It should have been an honor. The weapons school was the pinnacle of tactical aviation instruction. But for Vera, it felt like exile. She threw herself into the work with the same intensity she'd brought to combat. Her students, all experienced pilots themselves, initially approached her with the mixture of awe and skepticism reserved for living legends. That changed after the first flight. Vera might not have been able to pull 9GS anymore, but she could still fly an A-10 like she was born in the cockpit. More importantly, she could teach not just the mechanics of close air support, but the philosophy of it. "Combat aviation isn't about the aircraft," she told one class. "It's about the 18-year-old private first class who's scared, exhausted, and 10,000 miles from home. Every tactical decision you make has to center on them. Fuel calculations, weapons employment, risk assessment. It all comes down to that kid on the ground who's counting on you to get them home." Her students, many of whom had multiple combat deployments, found themselves taking notes like first-year cadets. But the classroom wasn't enough. Vera monitored every operation, read every after-action report, studied every engagement. She could feel the war continuing without her, could sense the patterns and rhythms of combat from thousands of miles away. When she learned that Harrison's platoon had taken casualties in a botched operation, an operation where close air support had arrived too late, something inside her broke. Or perhaps, more accurately, something that had been broken finally healed into a different shape. She submitted her retirement paperwork in September 2011, exactly 1 year after being shot down. The Air Force tried to convince her to stay. They offered her command positions, staff jobs at the Pentagon, anything to keep her expertise within the service. She declined them all. At her retirement ceremony, attended by hundreds of aircrew and special operators, she gave a speech that would be quoted in military journals for years. "I flew the A-10 for 20 years. In that time, I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that someone else's life is more important than your fear. Every one of you has made that decision. Continue making it." Jake Harrison was there, along with his entire platoon. After the ceremony, they presented her with a shadow box containing a piece of her crashed warthog, a section of the titanium armor that had saved her life, inscribed with the names of every soldier her actions had saved that night. The official count was 43. The unofficial count, including subsequent operations affected by her sacrifice, was much higher. Vera returned to Detroit, to the house where she'd grown up. Her parents had passed while she was deployed, another sacrifice to the endless war. She took a job teaching at the local community college, mathematics and physics, subjects that didn't require her to think about angle of attack or weapons release parameters. She ran every morning, the same 5-mile route she'd run as a teenager, though now her pace was slower, her left arm still weak from the injuries. The students at the college had no idea who their professor was. Dr. Kowalski, she'd earned her Ph.D. through correspondence during her deployments, was just the tough but fair instructor who demanded precision in every calculation. Sometimes, a student would notice the scar on her face and ask about it. Industrial accident, she'd say, which was true enough in its own way. War was, after all, an industry, and she'd been one of its most dedicated workers. She found peace in anonymity, in being just another face in the crowd. The nightmares faded, though they never fully disappeared. The phantom sensation of the aircraft responding to her touch gradually subsided. She started dating a history professor named Robert, a gentle man who'd never held a weapon more dangerous than a marking pen. He didn't know about Phoenix One, about the Medal of Honor recommendation that had been downgraded to a Distinguished Flying Cross for bureaucratic reasons, about the letters from Gold Star families that she kept in a box under her bed. For 5 years, this was her life. Teaching, running, quiet dinners with Robert, occasional visits to the local VFW where she'd sit in the back and listen to stories from Vietnam and Korea veterans who had no idea they were in the presence of one of the most decorated pilots of the modern era. She was content, if not happy. The war was something that had happened to someone else, someone she used to be. That changed on a Tuesday afternoon in September 2016. She was in the university library, preparing for the next day's lectures, when her phone buzzed with a news alert. A special operations team was trapped in Syria, surrounded by ISIS fighters. The situation was desperate. Close air support was having difficulty identifying friend from foe in the urban environment. Casualties were mounting. She recognized the tactical situation immediately. It was almost identical to Shai-Kot, the same envelopment, the same desperation in the radio calls that the news was broadcasting. She closed her laptop and walked to the window, looking up at the clear Michigan sky. Somewhere, thousands of miles away, pilots were making the same decisions she'd made countless times. Some would fly into the fire. Others would calculate the risk as too high. All of them would live with their choices forever. She thought about calling someone. Harrison was a commander now, still leading from the front. He might have information, but what would be the point? She wasn't Phoenix One anymore. She was just Dr. Kowalski, physics instructor. The trapped team was extracted after 16 hours of combat. 3 Americans killed, 7 wounded. The after-action reports, when they were finally leaked, revealed that the delay in effective close air support had been a critical factor. The A-10s had arrived, but the pilots, trained in a different era of combat, had hesitated to engage danger-close targets in the urban environment. They'd followed procedure, maintained safe distances, done everything by the book, and soldiers had died because of it. Vera started paying attention again. The war had evolved. ISIS was different from the Taliban, more sophisticated in some ways, more brutal in others. The technology had advanced. Precision-guided munitions were more precise, communication systems more robust. But the fundamental challenge remained the same: how to deliver overwhelming firepower in support of ground forces while minimizing collateral damage and friendly fire incidents. It was a problem she'd solved thousands of times, in conditions far worse than what the current generation of pilots faced. She began writing, not memoirs or war stories, but technical papers on close air support in complex environments. She published them under a pseudonym in military journals. The papers gained attention for their practical insights and innovative tactics. The Air Force Weapons School started incorporating them into their curriculum, without knowing their author was sitting in a Detroit community college, teaching freshmen how to calculate trajectories. One paper, on the psychological aspects of danger-close engagements, caught particular attention. She wrote about the moment of decision, when a pilot must choose between personal safety and mission accomplishment, between following regulations and saving lives. She provided a framework for making these decisions under extreme stress, a mental model that could be taught and practiced. The paper was required reading at flight schools within 6 months of publication. Harrison called her after figuring out she was the author. "Why the pseudonym?" he asked. "Because," she replied, "Phoenix One is dead. Let her rest. These ideas should stand on their own merit, not on who's writing them." But Harrison knew better. Phoenix One wasn't dead. She was just dormant, waiting for the right moment to rise again. That moment came in February 2017. A young Air Force captain named Jessica Riley had been shot down over Syria. She'd survived, but was facing a medical board that would likely end her flying career. Her story was eerily similar to Vera's, a female A-10 pilot who'd pushed too hard, taken too many risks to protect ground forces. Riley had read all of the pseudonymous papers, had built her entire tactical philosophy around them. When she learned through Pentagon connections that Vera was the author, she drove to Detroit unannounced. The knock on Vera's door came on a Sunday morning. Riley stood there in civilian clothes, but Vera recognized the bearing immediately. The straight spine of someone who'd strapped into an ejection seat, the alert eyes of someone who'd scanned for threats at 20,000 feet. "Major Kowalski," Riley said, using Vera's retired rank, "I need your help." Vera invited her in, made coffee, and listened to a story that could have been her own autobiography with names and dates changed. "They want to ground me," Riley said, her voice breaking slightly. "They say I'm too aggressive, that I take unnecessary risks. But you understand, when you hear those voices on the radio, when you know you're the only thing standing between those kids and death, how can you not push harder?" Vera saw herself 15 years younger, the same desperation to keep flying, to keep making a difference. But she also saw something else. An Air Force that still didn't understand the unique burden carried by those who fly close air support. Vera made a decision that would bring Phoenix One back from the dead. She called Harrison, now a captain in the SEALs and running special operations planning at JSOC. "Jake, I need a favor, a big one." Within a week, Riley's medical board received letters from 18 special operations commanders, all testifying to the necessity of pilots like her, pilots who understood that close air support was more than a mission, it was a sacred trust. The board reversed its decision. Riley would fly again. But Vera wasn't done. The Riley situation had revealed a systemic problem. The Air Force was training technicians, not warriors. Pilots who could hit targets with surgical precision but who lacked the moral courage to fly into hell when necessary. She started reaching out to her network, retired pilots, special operations veterans, the quiet professionals who'd spent their careers at the tip of the spear. Together, they formed an unofficial advisory group, providing mentorship to young pilots struggling with the same challenges Vera had faced. The group met monthly in various locations around the country. No official sanction, no government funding, just veterans helping the next generation understand the true nature of combat aviation. Vera taught them not just tactics, but philosophy. How to live with the weight of decisions that cost lives, both enemy and friendly. How to maintain humanity while dealing in death. How to come home from war without bringing the war home with you. One young pilot struggling with PTSD after a friendly fire incident asked her how she dealt with the guilt. Vera's answer was characteristically direct. "You don't deal with it, you carry it. Every life you take, every life you fail to save, you carry them all. The weight either crushes you or makes you stronger. The choice is yours, but make it consciously. Honor the dead by living with purpose." The pilot would later credit that conversation with saving his life. not from enemy fire but from his own hand. Word of the group spread through the special operations community. Ground force commanders started requesting that their supporting pilots attend Vera's sessions. The Air Force, initially suspicious of this unofficial organization, gradually came to recognize its value. The Chief of Staff of the Air Force himself, a former fighter pilot who'd been skeptical,